Now joined by Justin Dunk, who did an outstanding job with CFL.ca covering the CFL Combine. Justin, thanks for joining us. We can analyze the numbers all we want. We just went through a whole slew of them, but you were there for the one-on-ones. Who stood out for you in terms of the one-on-one drills?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me on, Jim, and I appreciate the kind words. Now, for the one-on-one drills in terms of the offensive and defensive linemen, Rupert Butcher was far and away the best defensive lineman in that group. Quinn Horton from Simon Fraser had a good showing as well. Then on the offensive line, Michael Couture had a sneaky good performance in the one-on-ones as an offensive lineman. And all those Laval guys, they were as advertised. They're rock solid. They're locked up pretty much as all first-round picks.
Now, if we go through the numbers, it would seem to be that this is a class that is strong but slow. What was up with those numbers across the board?
Well, I think you might be right, Jim, in terms of prospects on the defensive side of the ball. Now, there was a bit of an issue with the laser timing at the Combine. I'll give you one example. Shaquille Johnson, the receiver who was at McGill, then Western, then played CFL with the London Beefeaters, came in and run in the 4.3s on Thursday at the Toronto Regional. Then he comes and runs again on Sunday and runs in the 4.6s. So something was up with the laser times, and Jim Barker, when he was watching some of the 40s, was shocked at what some of the faster guys had run on laser. So I think for this Combine, that a lot of the scouts would have relied on their hand times. But I agree with you. On the defensive side of the football, it's not a very fast group. On offense, there are some speedier guys for sure.
We're accustomed to seeing running backs who are Canadian coming out of NCAA schools having success in the CFL. Andrew Harris being the exception to the rule coming out of the CJFL. But I think there were a lot of hopes pinned on Mercer Timmis, and Mercer admitted that he had a very disappointing Combine. Did his numbers affect him in terms of pushing him down the list at all? Because depending on who you talk to coming into this Combine, he was a mid to low first rounder, maybe a high second rounder, but could he slide based upon his performance?
I think it could be a combination of two things, Jim. As you said, I was hearing the same type of things, that's the range he could have gone in before the Combine. But he comes in and, as you said, didn't post great numbers, admitted that he thought he could have done better. And I think in combination with those numbers not being maybe up to what people thought they would be, and some other guys like a Brian Jones from Acadia coming in and blowing it up and sort of leapfrogging Mercer in terms of the overall prospect rankings, that yes, Mercer Timmis probably slides down the board a bit.
Well, you bring up Jones. Who, including him, went beyond expectations in your mind?
Oh, well, I got to go back to him, first of all, because Brian Jones talked about it after the Combine. And Jim, you know this well, that the AUS conference always gets slagged for maybe not being as competitive as the other three conferences in CIS football. And that was sort of part of the chip on his shoulder. And he came in and just blew this thing up the whole weekend. I heard he was a great interview. He obviously had great testing numbers that everyone can see. And in the one-on-ones, he completely ran over a defensive back when he tried to press him. I felt pretty bad for that poor kid. But Brian Jones was one. I think Michael Couture, I mentioned, had a good one-on-one session, but he showed he was a good all-around athlete as well. I think he was an offensive lineman coming into the Combine that wanted to try to get into that top tier of offensive linemen with the three Laval guys and Dylan Guy. And I think he probably put himself there with his showing.
Any minuses? We talked a little bit about Mercer Timmis, who probably holds steady, but who really kind of lost a step in this?
Well, there was some defensive linemen that you thought coming in were a little undersized. Denzel Phillip out of Eastern New Mexico was a guy that I talked to scouts about before the Combine, and they thought he should have put on some weight and tried to play on the interior of the defensive line. And he stayed at defensive end, and he honestly just looked a little too small. He's really well built, like he is chiseled, but he just doesn't have that strength to line up with tackles or the speed to be an edge rusher. So he needs to put on some weight and go inside, and that would help his draft stock. Another guy that I thought really underwhelmed was Josh Stanford, sort of this enigmatic receiver out of Virginia Tech, and then he was at Kansas and sort of fell out of favor at both of those schools. Still came in with a lot of talent, although a lot of questions. didn't do much to answer those questions. He actually skipped out on an interview with one of the CFL teams, didn't perform up to par in some of the athletic testing. So those would be a couple guys that I think stocks went down.
The Laval guys, you mentioned they came as advertised. I think in some ways they went above and beyond. They were very well prepared. Just how well do you think these Laval guys can do at the draft coming up?
Well, I think those three guys in Gagnon, Valancourt, and Lauzon-Saguet can all go in the first round. It's just a matter of what order and sort of personal preference and where you believe those guys can play. You know, most people see Valancourt as a guard for sure in this league and maybe the most pro-ready of the bunch. But a guy like Philippe Gagnon, who threw up 40 reps on the bench, showed his physical stamina, and with the type of body that he has, maybe projects better as a guy that has more potential in the pros. And Jason Lauzon-Saguet, I feel like, is sort of the most underrated in that group, but he could be right in there as well. So the most interesting thing, I think, will be to see how these guys come off the board when we get to draft day.
Well, let's talk about the guys who weren't there at the Combine, and there were a whole bunch, especially in the top five, and even St. John didn't participate at the Combine, even though he was there in attendance. Is there any way to fix this? Is it on the wrong date in the calendar? I know Kevin McDonald from the CFL was talking about a possible move of the Combine date. How can we fix this?
Well, I think there's sort of one of two ways to go. Either you run it around the NFL Combine, because the way that the NFL Combine is structured is that you go to the NFL Combine and then all of the players have their school pro days scheduled after that. So you either run it around the NFL Combine because you're likely not going to have a Canadian who's going to the NFL Combine ever come to the CFL Combine anyways, or you go later. You go maybe towards the end of March when a lot of the pro days are coming to an end, because what's happening right now is some of the upper tier guys like a Tavon Smith, like, you know, David Onyemata, who had his own pro day, or like a Trent Corney, who's having his own pro day at the University of Virginia. They're focusing on those pro days, and you can't fault those kids for that because they want to take a shot at the NFL and the kind of money that comes with it. So I think if you can figure out a way to schedule it where the kids don't have to make a decision about what's more important, my pro day or the CFL Combine, then you will have more of the top prospects showing up.
Well, neither of us were at David Onyemata's pro day, but what were your impressions from it? I think he has measurables and potential. I think some of those numbers maybe weren't up to the level that he wanted them to be up to. Tell me about your impressions of where David Onyemata's pro day landed him.
Well, going into the pro day, you already heard that NFL scouts were liking him and really felt like he could be a later round pick, maybe 5th, 6th, or 7th round. Now he goes into the pro day, put up a ton of reps on the bench press, looked quick and agile for 300 pounds. And some of his testing numbers were comparable with the top results of defensive linemen at the NFL Combine, Jim. So I think he boosted his stock and now is making a case to maybe get into rounds 4 or maybe even 3.
Wow, you got him going that high. I mean, in terms of some of his numbers, in terms of agility, I mean, you know, he's in around a 12th to a 15th in terms of position. But I'm assuming that for the position that NFL scouts see him playing, that's pretty good, is what you're saying.
It really is. And if you just look at the way that he moves, he's so smooth and he doesn't really look like he weighs 300 pounds. He carries it so well. He's been out in California training at Exos, one of the big combine prep facilities. So you knew he was going to be ready. He came up and put in some good numbers. And the one thing that you can't forget is who his agent is. Carter Chow is part of Yee and Dubbin Sports, who represents Tom Brady. So that shows me that if he had the interest in putting money into David and wanting him as a client, that he had to have some idea that Onyemata would be able to sort of rise up the board and be worth the investment.
Well, and I guess the one thing in terms of his measurables that really speaks to me is that wingspan. It's 7 inches longer than his height. I mean, that you can't train that, can you?
You can't train that. You can't coach that. And I think the word that you said before, Jim, potential, really gets scouts buzzing. And those are the type of guys that rise up draft boards. And that's exactly what Onyemata is doing.
Well, it rises up an NFL draft board, but what does this do to his CFL prospects? And which of these players in the CFL draft combine will actually have their values diminish thanks to NFL interest in your mind?
Well, it's tough to say at this point. Obviously, Onyemata, as his draft stock goes up, the CFL one goes the other way. There's some scouts in the CFL that don't ever even think David Onyemata will play it down in the CFL just because of his NFL prospects. But look at some of the other guys. It's very tough to tell because Tavon Smith, the receiver of Iowa, Arjun Colquhoun, defensive back out of Michigan State, Trent Corney, the D lineman out of Virginia. None of those guys got invited to the NFL Combine, and they didn't participate in any of those major college all-star games like the Senior Bowl or the East-West Shrine game. So it's hard to gauge where they're at now. I feel like they could be guys that get a UDFA deal or a minicamp invite, but that's a whole other thing than getting an actual contract and going to an NFL training camp. So until that point, we're really not going to be sure. I feel like Trent Corney could be a guy that is down in the NFL for a year or two just because his athletic numbers are so freakish and coaches will sort of think that they can mold him a little bit. But as for some of the other guys like Smith and Colquhoun, I think they could be in the CFL a little sooner.
One last thing before we let you go. Sean McEwen is still continuing to be evaluated by NFL scouts. Does he have a good shot and a serious shot in your mind at an NFL camp? And what does that say about staying an extra year in the CIS if you don't think the right offer or the right situation is out there for you?
Yeah, I think it was a good decision for him to go back to Calgary, especially if he really wanted to take that shot at the NFL, because he went through the whole experience last year. He was at New York Giants mini camp, would have received some coaching, would have received some guidance on what he needs to do to be an NFL player. The biggest problem with McEwen, and I hate saying this because it's a physical factor that he can't control, but he has short arms. He's going to be limited to being a center in the NFL, and that's what scouts will tell you. But that's something that he's never going to be able to change. He has changed his physique. He looks bigger. He had a good week at the Shrine game. So you would expect him to for sure go to a minicamp, and then from there, it's on him.
Well, and that's the other side of the Onyemata debate that we were having about what you're born with. Thanks very much. Appreciate it, Justin, and we look forward to talking to you in the not-too-distant future.
Thanks, Jim. Always fun being on Crown.